Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's first podcast episode with Dr. Cyril Amar. We are going to do every Friday weekly podcasts together, 1 hour conversations about global geopolitics with particular focus on what is happening in the West, in Europe, in the European Union, vis-a-vis Russia, in Ukraine, the United States versus China, and unipolarity, multipolarity. We have decided to do 1 hour podcast every Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern American time, 5 p.m. Central European time. And the name of the show is going to be Cold War 2.0. Tarik, first of all, I would like to thank you for accepting my invitation to come to Syriana Analysis on a weekly basis. I've been thinking about this for quite some time, and your name was mentioned multiple times. What matter for me is quality analysis and conversations with you, and also some laughter, since we also share the same humor. I think that would be also important for the people because the current geopolitical affairs are quite depressing. So let's start this podcast together.
Yeah, look, Kevork, let me at least say thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for thinking up this project. I love it. It's great.
Yeah, I actually indeed. Despite the depressing news and despite the claims that Donald Trump is the peace candidate, I am a little bit seeing things differently nowadays in the United States. Yes, I encourage Trump's, let's say, efforts to seek some sort of rapprochement with Russia that is for the benefit of everyone, especially for the Ukrainian people. However, he has also he's waging different types of warfares around the globe, one of which is this tariff war. Now, I'm quite ignorant about tariffs. I have to acknowledge that fact. But I would like to know, what is the tariff, first things first, like why the United States wants to impose these high tariffs on not only on China, but many other countries. What is the objective? Let's start with this of Donald Trump and why he has a particular focus on China.
Yeah, I'm, as you know, not an economist, although I'm a historian, and much of history is perhaps unfortunately driven by the economy. So my understanding is that it's extremely difficult to understand the rationale behind this tariff offensive on Trump's part and on the part of his administration, because it isn't very rational. It isn't very rational. One can try to figure out what they might want to be doing. They are making certain statements. We will get to that, what they think they are doing. But I think it's important to be clear that we don't try to impose on this a rationality it doesn't have, right? I really like the term that the economic historian Adam Tooze has recently coined for this. He called it sane washing, right? We shouldn't sane wash Trump's economic policies because they aren't very sane. So having said all of this, right, what he seems to want to do is most of all three things. One is the idea that he wants to reindustrialize the United States. So for Trump, and this is a very old idea, he formulated this publicly even when he was a private citizen in the 1980s already. For Trump, what has gone wrong in American recent history, one of the things that has gone wrong is that they have lost their industrial base, their manufacturing base, their factories, right? People making stuff, right? And they have shifted too far towards services and non-material parts of the economy, finance, and so on. He wants to keep all of this, of course, but he also wants a solid manufacturing base to come back to the United States. So in a way, he resists the decades-long trends of globalization and offshoring. He wants to onshore again, right? That's one thing. And how this connects to the tariffs, we have to get into this in a second. The second thing that he's trying to promise people is that the tariffs themselves will make so much money that the state doesn't have to tax them that much anymore, right? There is something fundamentally wrong about this promise, as every economist can tell you, but let's repeat it, which is that if you raise import tariffs, you are in effect taxing your population and your businesses, right?
Yes.
So this whole thing that he's setting up by saying, oh, I'm going to tariff these other countries, and then you Americans won't have to pay taxes, right? Or less taxes, is bullshit.
Yes.
Economically speaking, it's complete nonsense, right? Because the tariff that he puts on these outside countries, these importers, comes back in costs in various ways to the population and the businesses inside the United States, and it's de facto a tax, right?
Yes.
This is why some critics say that Trump has actually turned into a high tax president through his tariffs, right? That's number two. Number three, Trump has a very pathological relationship. I think it's obsessive. I think he really can't think clearly about this. He has a pathological relationship to trade deficits.
Yes.
For Trump, every trade deficit is not an expression of what happens in given economies in terms of investments and savings. It's an expression of something being deeply wrong, morally wrong, a raw deal in which the United States has been abused, he believes, right? So he wants to write, as he sees it, all these trade deficits. He has this very, very primitive and really misguided idea, economically speaking, that the answer to a trade deficit is to simply balance it out, force somehow the other side into such a relationship that in the end the deficit goes away. Now, there's one footnote to this, which is that on services, the United States runs a trade surplus with a lot of countries, and he never notices that.
Yes.
So if those countries were to apply the same
Logic.
bad logic to him or to the United States that he applies to them, things would get even more destructive because they would raise all sorts of de facto tariffs, it's a bit tricky, against the American services on which America has a surplus and the other countries have deficits, right? Now, these are the three main things we see sort of in the Trumpian rhetoric. Let me add one thing to be fair. A lot of observers acknowledge that there have been certain imbalances, sometimes really in the disfavor of the United States, very often in favor of the United States. He never sees that. So where there are imbalances in the United States' disfavor, he has a certain degree, to a certain degree a point. But the proportions here are very important. Nothing that he has done now makes any sense in response to that. It just doesn't work this way, and it is completely out of proportion. And in the end, it will hurt a lot of people outside the United States. But Trump, after all, is a national egotist, right? He doesn't acknowledge that people outside the United States count. Okay, let's for a moment think in his terms. It will also hurt a lot of Americans and a lot of American businesses. This is not going to work for anybody. That's the irony here.
Yep. Well, one of the commentators and critiques that I have read about this case was by Arnaud Bertrand, and he made some legit points here. I just summarized it in these highlights. He says the extreme tariffs on China are the exact same mistake as the sanctions on Russia and will have the same principal effect to prove in the eyes of the world the impotence of the United States. Which is pretty ironic when you think about it, as in many ways, one of Trump's key tasks in his mandate was to handle the US's defeat in Ukraine in a way that restores the US's image of strength. He hasn't even negotiated an end to the Ukraine war yet. He is already applying much the same script against China, an economic giant compared to Russia. Unlike what happened with Russia, the US has far less legitimacy to do so and is completely and utterly alone in this endeavor. Europe won't be there to pass the buck to when things predictably go south. China actually has very little dependence on exports to the US. They make up the equivalent of less than 3% of its GDP, and the immense majority of these aren't Chinese products, but American products made in China, like iPhones, Dell computers, Nike shoes, etc. It's not only end products like iPhone or Nike shoes that will suffer, but the entire US supply chain. Trump keeps saying that imports are bad, that the US needs to become autarkic and make everything at home. But according to the US National Association of Manufacturers, an incredible 56% of goods imported to the US are actually manufacturing inputs, with a lot of that coming from China. So, how on earth can the US develop manufacturing at home if that is indeed the objective here, while cutting itself from the manufacturing inputs? Anyone with an ounce of common sense can see that the logic is absurd. So, this can't be just the idea of Trump, right? He has a big economic team in his administration, and they're all envisioning or they're all planning on this strategy, let's say vis-a-vis China, particularly, in order to rebalance the trade relationship, to bring back the manufacturing, let's say, powerhouses to the United States. Those are America first, let's say, policies, right? This is the goal, to bring the manufacturers and factories back home. But the strategy that you say and many others experts say is wrong. But if things go south, I think in this case, then the damage to the US economy could be irreversible, especially that the US is also saying or preparing for another costly war in the Middle East. This sounds a little bit suicidal for me.
Well, it's interesting that you said irreversible damage, right?
Yeah.
You know how I think about the de facto despot of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And nevertheless, I have to agree with her on one thing. She has said today, or maybe she said it yesterday, very recently, that there is no way back to the status quo already. No way back to the status quo already. Now, and you know as well as I do that Ursula von der Leyen doesn't serve the Europeans. She actually serves Washington, right? She's basically an American agent. So if this American agent at the head of the European Union actually also says what Trump has done is in effect so bad that there's no way back to the status quo before, then clearly something irreversible has already happened. And you're absolutely right about this. So these people, these MAGA fans of Trump, who still try to rationalize his recent steps, right, since so-called Liberation Day, right, by saying, oh, that was all just, a tactical ploy. He was just putting on the pressure, so they have to come and negotiate with him. Or as he himself said that, I'm quoting an American president, they have to come and kiss his ass, right?
Yes.
This is his language, right? All these
they
people
are kissing his ass. This is what he said.
Yes. But the people who think that this was a brilliant chess game, that he used these tactics of arm twisting, and now they will get everything they want in the trade relationships, and otherwise there is no loss. Otherwise it goes back to as things were before. They are completely wrong. Even if certain trade relationships, and he will manage to do that, are sort of recalibrated to be even more advantageous to the United States, they will also pay a price already, right? Yes. And the price is that they have shown how far they are willing to go. And they have shown it not only towards China, right? That's bad enough. They've shown it to everyone, literally everyone in the world at once this time.
Yep.
I'm so sorry, including their allies. I'm having some water here. That experience will not go away anymore. So they've given a big push, even to people in Europe, even to people in the European Union who are extremely submissive and want to obey the United States. Even these people, they have forced them to think about a future in which the United States is not only not a reliable partner militarily, talking about NATO and all that, but is a very dangerous force in the world economy, out to ruin them. Not that that's the first time.
Yep.
Now, considering China, it's really hard to see how Trump thinks this can end. Because look, he has made a point of humiliating China in his rhetoric. Famously, this is a country with an extremely intense, and rightly so, memory of being humiliated by the West in a quasi-colonial situation, right? They call it the 100 years of humiliation. And the Chinese and their government, and I think they are seeing the world in the same terms there, see it as the great achievement of post-revolutionary, post-World War II, essentially China, that whatever else happened, it put an end to that. And it then rose to such power and such wealth that this can no longer be done to it.
Yes.
And here comes Trump and essentially says to, literally personally, to the ruler of China, to Xi Jinping, kiss my ring. Come here first and bow, and then we can talk. And there comes this primitive, I'm sorry, idiot, Scott Bessent, right? And says, oh, they shouldn't retaliate. That was a stupid idea,
Yeah.
Why didn't they just let us slap them in the face? Everything would be okay, right? It tells you a lot about Scott Bessent, by the way, and people like him because that's how they make their career. That's probably what he's done a lot in his life. He got slapped in his face by his superiors and he didn't retaliate. And that's how he rose, right? That's how he sees the world. But he doesn't understand that the Chinese are on one side more honorable, but they're also wiser. Because the Chinese understand that if you let them do this to you, there will be no end. Not only to humiliation, but to exploitation. They will try then to do to you what they just tried to do to Russia. Namely, they will try to degrade you into a second-rate power. And there we come back to what you said at the beginning, which is there's something here reminiscent of the attack on Russia that unfolded since basically 2014 and then intensified, right? Very reminiscent. Because although up until now, in the case of China, they're not yet using military means directly or through proxies, what they're trying to do, the aim is very similar. They're trying to destroy a competitor. They're trying to take them down in the geopolitical hierarchy. And Beijing sees this, of course, because it's damn obvious. I mean, if you miss this, you must be blind, right? So this is an all or nothing situation. This isn't just about trade at all. This isn't just about trade at all, and they will not give in. At least they will not give in first, and they will not give in alone. The best that Trump still can hope for is that the Chinese allow him somehow in the end to save a little face. But they will definitely not submit to him. And what a lot of economists tell us is, look, the share of Chinese exports to the world, right? The share of that goes to the United States is about 15%. You mentioned GDP. This is another statistic. That means that, yes, the United States can do damage. It can. It will also damage itself in the process. But it cannot prevail. This whole idea that Trump seems to have, that the United States has such power over China that it can simply impose its will, is completely misguided. It's unrealistic. It is as unrealistic as the idea of those people who tried to take down Russia through Ukraine. So this is going to be their second attempt to do something very stupid, right? And here's another point. They are also making double sure, because this is sure anyhow, but they're adding something. They're making double sure that the Russians and the Chinese will stay together in what is de facto an alliance already. They're making it
bringing
so
them
clear.
even closer again. Yes.
Of course they are. Of course they are. None of this makes sense. But one last point, and I'm talking too long, but one last point. I think if you want to see why the Trumpists are doing what they're doing, not that it will work, but why they're trying to do this, I think you have to think not in terms of what advantages do they hope to gain for America, not with respect to China. The policy toward China is much more aggressive. It's what are they trying to do to China? This is
Yes.
about destroying China, not even about gaining advantage for the US. And they will fail.
You know, I noticed also two things in this case. One is I don't want to generalize because I hate it, but every time I see American talking heads, whether on social media or on, let's say, TV outlets, and they're pushing against a war, then a few years later, you could see that this person is doing exactly what he said that he is opposing if in the previous administration, such as a war against Ukraine. And in the US, it's always you find people enthusiastic about war. You find people, influential people, who will find always excuses for the US administration to go to war, either in Ukraine against Russia or in Iran for Israel or China through trade wars. So if you scratch an American, in very few exceptions, I'm talking about people who are politically involved and active, you will always see someone enthusiastic about war. And this is also embodied nowadays in the character of Donald Trump. That Donald Trump is the one who is telling his people, like, we're going to make America great again, and our greatness is our military might, our economic might, and also the attitude. When you see how J.D. Vance talks to other world leaders, when you see how Trump says the world leaders are kissing his ass, basically, it's the highest representation of the U.S. empire value system, let's say, and the Trump administration is being the most blunt and honest among the other administrations. The other day, people were upset on me for saying Trump is honest. This is exactly what I mean. When you show the exact face that the US empire is about, whereas in the past they were putting all this makeup of liberalism, democratic values, and so many other things regarding gender and ideologies, etc. But now it's quite obvious that they're talking about the hard geopolitical facts. This is about economic competition. This is about natural resources. This is about geopolitics. This is about world domination. This has nothing to do with spreading democracy and human rights that the previous administrations claimed. So this is something that I wanted to explain, and that is this administration shows you clearly what the US is. And this makes me happy because I can now understand. I was arguing about this for a long time. Like, this is the objective of the United States. But now it's quite clear for the people to see, like, Trump doesn't come and say, oh, we will create a two-state solution for the Palestinians. No, he's saying we will ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, right? Like the previous administration said to the Palestinians, go to negotiations with Israel. You will get your state, inshallah, sometime in the future. So you have to go from one accord to another, from one conference to another. Meanwhile, the settlements are expanding. So this is why I say this is the best probably U.S. administration, because it shows you clearly who they are, and gives the other powers also the opportunity to know how to deal with them, because now the intentions are quite clear as well. Not like the Russians and the Chinese didn't know about it, but now also the people, ordinary people, can see through the US empire. But you have also another political entity, and this is the EU. You already addressed what Ursula von der Leyen said. But when the tariff war started between Washington and China, let's say, initiated by the United States, there has been several opportunities for Europe and the European Union to reorient or reshuffle its, let's say, diversify its relationship with the growing powers, especially the economic powers, right? And in this case, for example, I always said the US withdrawal from the military support in Ukraine and abandoning Ukraine could be an opportunity for EU to seek better relationship with China, and they missed that train. And now with this tariff war, again, there was another window of opportunity. And now Kaja Kallas comes and says, China is the key enabler of Russia's war. And like, like this provocation against China, for me at least, it's not understandable, because China could be a partner with the European Union and could be a good partner. Let's say beneficiary relationship is possible between the EU and China. but then you see that there is something like it's a Stockholm syndrome or something, like in the European Union officials, that they would like to keep themselves under these growing economic powers, like as if they're tasked to keep the European Union in its current place and even sink further.
Look, I think personally that if the 27 member states now of the EU had all of them more or less reasonable governments, even with some ideological differences, right? I think by now it's absolutely clear that these countries, together as the EU and even individually, have to try to balance against the United States. And the major powers, the two major powers that come to mind immediately, they're not the only relevant countries, but the two major powers that come to mind immediately, with whom they could balance, are China and Russia. Now, unfortunately, the EU, since really the end of the Cold War, has ever more rapidly turned itself into an extremely Russophobic association. You can see it in the European Parliament, which comes out with bizarre resolutions against Russia from time to time. That's one of their main jobs. You can see it in the way that Britain and France cannot let go of the idea of sending some sort of expeditionary force to Ukraine to be defeated there by Russia, because that's what would happen. You can see it, of course, in the appointment of a clear failure, such as Callas, who is incompetent and insane, to be de facto foreign minister of the EU. All of these things point in the same direction, namely that for some reason, an extremely irrational Russophobic attitude rules in the EU. And there has been a similar, but not the same, a similar trend against China, that was feeding this whole rhetoric about decoupling, de-risking, and so on. Now, what I find interesting is that very recently, with respect to China, I think there are some signs that there are people in the EU who would like to change course a little bit. I find that very interesting. And it's possible. Of course, I don't know the future, but I think it's possible that Trump may have gotten so far that the Europeans are not revising their attitude toward Russia. They're too insane for that right now. They're too embittered, they're too obstinate. But that some of them are beginning to revise their attitude toward China. Why are we now hearing about a possible summit between EU representatives and Xi Jinping? Mm-hmm. Why has the leader of Spain, Sanchez, gone out of his way to show the United States that he doesn't care what Scott Bessent says about Spain's relationship with China? As you know, Scott Bessent came out and said, well, if Spain sort of tries to deal with China, it's like cutting their own throat. What a beautiful image. Yeah, talk like that about your allies. Sanchez has now gone out of his way to show, we will talk to China, right? So I see a tiny difference there. I see an interesting difference there in the way that they're absolutely stubborn about Russia, and they shouldn't be. But there seems to be some people who are ready to treat China differently. Now, people like Callas, of course, will never be any good for anything. And the real question there is, will the EU ever recalibrate? Will the EU ever manage to retreat at least a little bit from this, I'm sorry, East European obsession, compulsion with beating up on Russia, right? It's really the tail wags the dog. Estonia, which I'm sorry has a climate of extreme Russophobia, and I know certain people will hate me for saying this, and we constantly have to talk about how they're on the border and how they used to be a Soviet republic. But nevertheless, Estonia is insane with Russophobia. And it's a country and a leadership that is trying very successfully to export that Russophobia to all of us. And it's similar for Lithuania, and it's not so much better for the Poles, right?
Yes.
So when the EU went east, which by now I greatly regret, I regret that NATO went east, and I very much regret that the EU went east too.
Yes.
When the EU went east, it absorbed all of these Russophobes. And instead of getting them to be a little less neurotic, the whole EU became more neurotic. Will that ever change? I don't know. But I find it interesting that the tone towards China is a little bit different. And now, if you think about the future, Trump and the Americans are pushing the Chinese and the Russians even closer together.
Yep.
Some Europeans seem to be ready to talk to the Chinese more than to the Russians.
Yes.
If that develops, maybe there's a way back through the contact with China to becoming a little less insane about Russia. If you're all very, very, very lucky. But of course, people like Carlos will do their utmost to prevent this and to get us to World War III, because that's what they're really dreaming about, a big
Yeah.
Western war against Russia. And what has changed is that they're even ready to do this without the US, right? Under Biden, the game was, hey, maybe we can get NATO into war against Russia, and then the US will be forced to come in with all their power, right? And defeat Russia for us, right? Now the game seems to be, you know what? If the US isn't ready to come in, we do it on our own.
We do it alone. Yeah. From the pockets of the people. From the pockets of the people.
Which is even more insane, because Europe alone in a war with Russia would lose.
Yeah.
It would be extremely destructive for Russia too. I don't doubt that. Europe could do some damage, but Europe would lose. Definitely in the end.
Yeah, when I said financing from the people's pocket, I'm not claiming to be an economist right now, but just a regular person living in Germany. When before the war started in Ukraine, the electricity bill in my apartment, which is a one-room apartment, was 45 euros. 2 years later, it became 95 euros. And yesterday, I received another email from the company saying they have now to increase it to 100 and 102 euros. So it's more than 100% increase in the electricity bills, basically, on the people. And despite that, the recently elected Chancellor of Germany, who hasn't become yet the Chancellor, right? Friedrich Merz. They have published a 144-page document about the security and geopolitical aspirations of Germany. And in this agreement, the German government wants to seriously address the issue of the tribunal. They mean Russian President Vladimir Putin is to be tried by a, quote, special tribunal for the conflict in Ukraine. And the document says, quote, we support the creation of a special tribunal for the proper prosecution and punishment of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. And at the same time, like, you know what is my issue, Tarik, with this? If there is consistency about the European value-based foreign policy, I wouldn't really say much. But if you go after Putin and you protect Netanyahu in this case, this goes beyond hypocrisy. And also, it seems that the politicians in Germany have decided that they're going to go all the way in this militarization of Germany and preparation of the country for a possible war with Russia.
It looks like that right now, right? It's difficult to tell. I think what's behind this is sort of an unofficial coalition, not as between SPD and CDU, but a coalition of political actors and forces in Germany. And some of these people, I think, don't necessarily want that war. They want the rhetoric about the war and then to make tons of money for themselves out of rearmament. That's one thing, right? But I think there are also people who really want the war, right? So this is a very explosive mixture. Look at it like this. I was seeing an article today in Spiegel. And Spiegel talks about some sort of internal report that Spiegel got to know about, which shows that a lot of the weapon systems that the Germans gave to the Ukrainians don't work well at all. And guess what? Their weakness is what has always been the weakness of German weapons, which is they're over-engineered. They're very sophisticated and complicated, and then they get stuck in the mud. that's the ground rule, right? The
Yep.
Kalashnikov keeps shooting. The German gun doesn't keep shooting, although it's very, very complicated, right? So this is an oversimplification, but still, the gist of the Spiegel article is a lot of these weapon systems that we gave to the Ukrainians haven't worked well in the war, right?
Yep.
Now you look at this article, and at first sight you think, oh, that's great. Finally, Spiegel is actually saying something that's a little bit critical, right? But
Yep.
then you look at it again and you think, oh, maybe the message is we have to buy a lot of new stuff because the
Yes.
old stuff was tested in Ukraine and it isn't working so well. So let's
Yes.
buy more, right? And I
Or
think that is
manufacture
the
more.
message. Yeah,
Or manufacture
exactly.
more. It seems
Exactly.
that there are many also military contractors or lobbyists
Of course.
also in
Of course. No,
one
and
of
not
the
only that, you have people in German politics who hold shares in
Mm,
companies that directly profit from a rise in armament massively.
wow.
It's very concrete, right? Yeah, absolutely. It's like Trump insider trading, just with guns.
Wow. One of the enthusiasts, let's say, about this militarization of Germany and sending more weapons to Ukraine, I will show her photo to the audience. And and I don't know if she's going to be the first one to enlist and go and fight this, but Frau Zimmermann, Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann from the FDP.
Strack Zimmermann, yes.
She's been accused by many other people in Germany and politicians of being a lobbyist for the arm
She is. But
factories.
we can't say that. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. If anybody heard that, I didn't say it. Because you know what? She loves to sue people. That's the
Mhm.
other thing she does. She
I just said
sues
she's
people.
accused by other people.
Exactly.
I'm not
Exactly.
adopting this line. I don't know.
Exactly. Exactly. Agnes, if you're listening to us, we're just saying you're being accused by a
Yeah.
lot of people.
The other day,
I
the
mean,
Ministry of Interior, she sued someone online
oh,
for
Father, yeah,
making
Father
a,
sued somebody, yeah, and
yeah,
he got sentenced to several months in prison. Why he doesn't
for
actually have to go to prison, but still, you know, the
for
sentence is
making a
7 months.
meme, basically, for
Yes,
making a meme. So I cannot show the meme to you guys because
it's
then
very harmless.
I could also
It's very
I could
harmless.
also go 7 months to jail. Basically, it's a
Yeah.
banner. She says, "I hate free speech" or something, right?
Ich hasse die Meinungsfreiheit. Exactly. I hate
Yeah, ich
free
hasse die
speech or
Meinungsfreiheit.
freedom
Yeah.
of opinion. And
Mhm.
what's so interesting is when I first heard about this case, my first reaction was, this shouldn't happen at all. This is
Mhm.
horrible. But then I thought, I wonder what he did, right?
Mhm.
Still, it shouldn't happen, but maybe it was something horrifically misogynistic and
Yeah.
personal and you
Yes.
really horrific. And then I saw the meme, and it's the mildest, most harmless thing I can imagine.
Mhm.
If that gets punished now, there's absolutely no freedom of opinion. Maybe she's watching us. We're going to be sued too. Maybe we're going to go
Yes.
to prison for having said this, right?
Yes.
I
And
mean, look,
she's the
it's
same.
ridiculous.
She's the same minister, right? When she went to Qatar wearing the pride flag here and
Oh yeah,
imposing.
did you do that?
Yeah,
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 yeah, that's
she do
good.
that. She did
Look,
that
but Kevork,
despite the ban.
if I may come back to one thing, right? This whole thing about a tribunal and generally going
Mhm,
after the Russian leadership, right? Not only mm, legally, which doesn't work in the end, but also in terms of rhetoric, right?
mhm,
I would like to say that I totally agree with you. In a world where Benjamin Netanyahu is not on trial, right, and sentenced at least to lifelong imprisonment, and I would like to see a harsher punishment for him, I would. In such a world, nobody has a right to say anything about Putin.
mhm.
Nothing Russia has done in Ukraine. I'm well aware that there have also been aspects of their warfare that, weren't correct, could become the object of legal criticism, and so on. But nothing that Russia has done in Ukraine is remotely comparable at all with what the West and Israel Israel and the West have done together to the Palestinians.
Yeah.
We are now in a place, before the West and Israel carried out, and they're still carrying it out, this genocide in plain view together. Before that, we had the comparison with Iraq, the Iraq War, right? And even then, it was clear that the Iraq War was, in some ways, I would now argue, a clearer case of war of aggression than even Putin's attack of 2022. Because Putin actually can make a fairly good case that Russia was forced to do this. It's still an attack. I get it. But the people who started the Iraq War, Bush, Blair, and so on, they can't make a case they were forced at all. They faked the evidence of the so-called weapons of mass destruction and so on. Let's not go over this. But the point is, even before the Gaza genocide happened, right, it was clear that if you compared what Russia did in 2022 in Ukraine with the Iraq war that the West started, there was no basis for the West to blame Russia. I'm sorry. Yeah, it depends on, they had no standing. But now things are much, much clearer again, because you cannot even remotely compare what the West and Israel have done and what Russia has done. The West and Israel have co-perpetrated and are co-perpetrating genocide. The Russians are definitely not co-perpetrating or perpetrating genocide in Ukraine. Absolutely not. And anybody who claims that is simply a cheap demagogue. I'm tired of that, right? The Israelis are committing genocide, and the West with them. So, some German politician trying to talk about a tribunal? What? That's ridiculous. I'm not listening. It's done.
Merz also, we can criticize his foreign policy a lot with legitimate points, but it seems that the German people also, when they voted for him, let's say big portion of them voted for the CDU-CSU coalition, but he promised them a lot of things, and the people voted him for basically for these policies. But I have seen him saying things like just before the election and then right after the result of the election, different statements. And I think this is probably the first elected chancellor, or the chancellor to be, who his party loses points before he even becomes the chancellor.
Yes.
Like he's now even below the AFD. The AFD is 25 and the CDU-CSU coalition are 24. So Germans also expecting from him to respect his promises, and in this case there are very serious cases in Germany: financial, the energy crisis, the migration crisis, borders and security in the country. People care about security, food, cheap products and taxes, right? But all the focus is on foreign policy. All the focus is on this very dangerous Russian bear who is going to march to Berlin very soon. So we have to even spend more. And this is just going to increase the prices in Germany and more inflation. And I think this is only preparing the way for AfD to win the next elections.
Yeah. Look, first of all, to address this basic narrative, this story that people in Germany and in other EU countries are now being told, which is that we have to arm ourselves, we have to train up for war, we have to become ready for war, kriegstüchtig in German, right?
Yeah.
Because we know already that the Russians want to attack us soon. That story is complete nonsense too. Complete nonsense. There's not a grain of plausibility to this. It is true that the Russians are fighting a war in Ukraine, and if you analyze why they're doing it, you can see why. You can agree, you can disagree. But none of these rationales that come into play there on Moscow's side indicate that they want to fight another big war against Poland, Germany, France, and so on. That's just not the case. This is a classical case of war hysteria. And if there's any way to get Russia into a war with the rest of Europe, then it's Europe going on with this hysteria. That could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because this is the classical security dilemma. If we all arm up like hell, and if the Russians look at a Germany stacked with enormous tank armies again, that might change their perspective.
Yeah.
That might actually change their perspective. As it is now, we have no reason to prepare for a Russian attack because there's no reason to assume Russia actually wants to launch one. I know that we are being told the opposite. It's propaganda. And how do we know it's propaganda? There's one simple way to test this, which is this. If our leaderships in Europe, in Berlin, in Paris, in London, really thought the Russians are getting ready to attack us in a few years, you know what they would do? Maybe they would arm, but they would also go to the Russians and negotiate. They would seek contact. I bet you, if they really thought the Russians are preparing a war of aggression against all of Europe, they would seek negotiations. They might at the same time arm themselves. So what we would then see in reality is a double track policy, where they would say, we have to build up our military forces to be on the safe side, but we also have to talk to the Russians to try to prevent the escalation. They know the Russians are not planning an attack, and you can see it by the fact that they don't care about diplomacy at all. They don't care. All they're caring about is not talking to the Russians, but talking to their own populations. And you know what? Talking to the Russians would even disturb them. Because if they went and talked to the Russians, there would be information that would show populations in Europe that the Russians are ready to talk. That's a risk for them, because they want to have the possibility to misrepresent the Russians as dead set on war, which they're absolutely not. So that's one thing. But the other thing about Merz, which you of course mentioned, is that he has already massively disappointed his core electorate. Because what do conservatives want? They want austerity. They want fiscal prudence. Now, I'm not for that sort of thing because I'm not a conservative. My apologies. But I can understand conservatives who have voted for Merz and who are angry now because they got the opposite. They got an immense deficit spending program, which probably will not work very well. And one reason why it won't work very well is that so much of it is geared to the military. And as every economist will tell you, the military is to an extent necessary, it's true, but it's not a productive thing to invest in. Because a military is a thing that you keep ready, it's an insurance. Most of the time, that investment doesn't give you anything except obsolescence. You buy yourself a nice brigade of tanks in year 1, and in 5 years, the tanks are obsolescent. You buy yourself the next brigade. Those tanks have produced nothing. You can argue that there are sort of spin-off effects. Maybe something happens in research and so on. You know what the best example is that spin-off effects don't save your economy? The Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union had a wonderful military-industrial complex in which they invested like hell. And what did it give them? It gave them economic ruin because they neglected the civilian economy, right? So this whole story that you now get warmed up in Germany, like, oh, it's so great if Rheinmetall moves into the production facilities of Volkswagen. It's actually a nightmare. That's an economic nightmare. And that we're being sold this as a happy end story or a happy beginning story only shows how insane our propaganda has become. Now, let me put it like this. I actually think Germany needs deficit spending. The debt brake is idiotic. Absolutely. But the terrible thing in Germany is that they have now engaged in deficit spending for exactly the wrong things.
Yes. Is this why also, or is this one of the reasons why the right-wing forces in Europe and in Germany, they accuse these establishment parties of being communists? Like, I keep hearing this is a communist approach, like all the accusations that I heard from the liberals, not the liberals, sorry, the conservatives and the right-wings, populists, let's say, against the establishment parties, that they're communist, and this is a communist approach.
It's insane. I'm sorry, but there's an immense confusion in those heads. You know, the CDU, they're not communists. You know, if those guys are socialists, what am I? I'm sorry, but that doesn't make any sense at all. No, They are mostly conservatives. I disagree with them on almost everything, but the weirdest thing about them is that they're not even consistent anymore.
Hmm.
And look, to talk about what that means, right? You mentioned the AfD. Now, if you want to be very, very correct, the poll you quoted, I think, is an Ipsos poll, and it showed the AfD 1% ahead of the CDU and
Yes.
CSU. And what that means is that they, in this poll, are the single most popular party in Germany. And this has never happened before. Now, some people, there are always some pedants, right, are going to tell you, but there are other polls published about at the same time, and there the AfD isn't ahead yet, right?
Mhm.
They're still 2 points behind the CDU or they're sort of head to head, whatever. And that's true.
Mm.
But it's not important, because the important point is the trend. And the trend is unbroken. The trend is that the AfD is rising, rising, rising. And when the AfD was locked out of government coalition building by the so-called firewall strategy, right? It
What is the
didn't break
firewall?
it.
What is this firewall strategy? Just for the people, because I heard
Oh,
also a lot that
firewall
there is a
means
firewall.
that
Yeah.
the parties that are not popular anymore,
Hmm.
they get together and decide that the really popular party cannot play. That's a firewall, right? And the important thing about the firewall is to understand that it has no basis in the constitution or in law.
Hmm. Hmm.
None at all. I think if you challenge the firewall, constitutionally, it's probably unconstitutional to do this,
Hmm.
because you're devaluing the votes for that party. Look, I'm not an AfD voter. I'm the opposite. I'm left, very left. But if somebody votes for AfD and the people in the SPD and the CDU, the leaderships and the Greens and the Linke decide, you can vote as long as you like. Your party never will get into government.
Hmm.
You're basically saying your vote is different from all other votes. It's
Hmm.
massive discrimination, right? Now, some people will say the AfD is partly far right, at least in part. And that's true. In part, it's a far right party, although not only. I would define it as populist right and far right, right? It's a very complicated mix. Okay. But if your problem is that the AfD is something that you think doesn't belong in German democracy because of its ideology, then the path forward is to try to prohibit it. Oh, you can't do that? Oh, that means that you don't have anything to stand on. That means they're legitimate. I'm sorry,
Yes.
same law for everyone. If the AfD is not prohibited, then it's a party that should have the same conditions as everybody else. And I'm, by the way, against prohibition and attempts at prohibition. So this whole idea of the firewall is totally perverse. I think it's unconstitutional. It's actually unconstitutional to do this. Now, but back to the initial point. What the firewall has done is they've locked them out of government building. If the firewall hadn't existed after the last election, the coalition that Germany should have seen emerge immediately, very quickly, would have been CDU and AfD. Arithmetically,
Yes.
ideologically, very clearly, that would have been the coalition, right? Now, you can wonder what happens to a party when it's locked out like this. You could think that its voters and supporters in general get discouraged. So maybe you see a downturn. No, the opposite has happened.
Positive.
They're still rising, rising, rising. And that is most likely to be the future too. And why is that the case? Partly because Merz has led the CDU into this weird territory where a lot of CDU voters and even members are very dissatisfied, right? They are very dissatisfied. They're saying, we voted conservative and we are not getting the conservative politics we wanted. And you know
Yes.
what? They have a point. So, with that dissatisfaction, where are they going to go? Right? They're going to go to the AfD.
Yeah, this is
How
what's happening.
Merz thinks this is going to work, I have no
Yeah.
idea, right?
For context, guys, the AfD had 3% in 2013, and it's now like around 25%. It's
Yeah.
crazy big in one decade.
Yeah.
And I live here, and to be honest with you, I know people who vote for AfD, and they voted previously for central left
Yeah.
parties. They voted
Yeah.
for Linke, which is the left party, and now they're voting
Look,
for AfD out of frustration from the system itself
look at the
prevailing in the
personnel.
country.
Gauweiler, right?
Mhm.
Many people forget that he's former SPD.
Mhm.
He's former SPD. This has happened before. And if you go down in the AfD hierarchies into the localities again and again, I'm not doing this systematically, but I read
Mhm.
some sort of Spiegel, Faz, Welt thing,
Mhm.
and it says so and so got elected for the AfD until 2000 so and so he was either in the CDU or the SPD.
Yes.
There is a shift happening here because these people, voters, and even politicians themselves, local politicians, feel that their parties have gone away from them.
Yes. I mean, if you listen to Merkel's old speeches like 15 years ago or so, and compare them to Alice Weidel's speeches now, you will not find so much the differences between them. It's the CDU which shifted from the right-wing pop,
No.
let's say, conservatism into more centrist or even liberal, let's say, in this case.
Let me put it like this. I think what is happening to the CDU, and this has started before Merz, right?
Mhm.
But I think he's an important figure in this process, is it is becoming entirely now a neoliberal party.
Mhm.
It used to be a complicated mix, right? There used to be elements of social conservatism in there, cultural conservatism. There even used to be elements of belief in a welfare state in there. Yeah, in the old CDU. I remember that CDU, right? I
Mhm.
still didn't like it, but I remember it. But the CDU that you're now getting, Merz is not the only one, but his rise has to do with this, is a purely neoliberal party. And then on top of that, having become a neoliberal party, they also become a deficit spending party,
Yes.
right? So you wonder who's supposed to buy this? What
Yep.
sort of weird package is this?
Yep, yep. You know, Tarek, the other day I was thinking, I mean, I don't have the right to vote in Germany. And even if I have the right, I will never vote for several reasons. One of which I don't believe that my voice would make a change. And secondly, I think that as a non-German who migrated to Germany and then after, I don't know, some years, you get to vote to decide the fate of a country, which is like their ancestors have been here for decades. I don't think like I should vote. This is just my personal opinion. However, when I watched the political discussion in the Bundestag and the debate on the TV outlets between different political parties, I always find myself like, there has to be some sort of, merging between what Sarah Wagenknecht's party is saying and some of the things that the AfD is saying. And if you bring them together, maybe it makes more sense, But the rest of the parties, those who call themselves the centrist parties, center right, center left parties, they are echoing each other's opinions when it comes to the big headlines. And this is something that it doesn't change much in Germany, whether you vote to center right or center left, because you bring a party like CDU, and then the CDU will need the SPDs and the Greens and the Linkes to bring into the government coalition to rule. And then these parties will definitely impact the discourse of the government, and it's not going to be conservative, let's say, government. And this is why the people increasingly, I see people even becoming more vocal about the AfD. Previously, it was a taboo to say like I vote
Yes,
for AfD,
that's very
or
true.
no.
Yeah,
People are now just normal, like they're
yeah.
going to demonstrations in the streets without hiding their
They
faces.
took all of East Germany, all of
Hmm.
it,
Hmm.
right? And they made serious progress in West Germany too, which is often overlooked. They
Hmm.
aren't outsiders. Think of them what you will, but they're not outsiders.
Yeah, they're Germans. Yeah. Tarek, this was our first podcast conversation together. For those who tuned in later, we are going to do regular podcasts with Tarek every Friday, 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time, and this show is called Cold War 2.0, and we're going to discuss global geopolitical issues, unipolarity, multipolarity, all the issues that we discussed today on the international level between the US, China, US, Russia, China-Russia relationship, and the European Union as well. For those who are interested to follow this, of course, you need to subscribe to this YouTube channel and share this video with your friends, and also follow Tarek's personal X account Tarik Cyril Amar, which is also embedded in the description below. You can hit him a follow. We will also make shorter videos from these longer conversations and post them on X so that the people can also catch some of the snaps. So that would be also amazing to follow Tarik there. Tarik, thank you so much for this brilliant
Thank you.
conversation together.
Thank you.
I will see you next Friday in the next episode. And during this time, I hope World War III is not going to break loose. That's why I call this show like a Cold War 2.0, because we're increasingly going into that path.
Yeah. That's optimism nowadays, to think that World War III isn't happening within a week.
Exactly, like in a matter of days. Guys, I also would like to thank you all for those who watched this live streaming on YouTube, on Rumble, on Ganjing Word, and I will see you very soon on Monday. So peace be upon you, upon your families. Salam.
Bye-bye.